Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I do hope it finds you well. My name is John, and I'm an author, and welcome to my writing space. I'm coming to you here on another Thursday, although I'm filming this fairly late in the day. This is probably going to get posted on Friday, of another Storytime Thursday, where I'm going to be reading chapter 22 of my first book, The Shadows of the Past. Before we get started on that, I do hope you like, share, subscribe, leave your comments and thoughts. All of that helps out a new and attempting to grow channel like myself, and I would really appreciate it, as that would help me out. Without further ado, we will get started here on Chapter 22, The Battle of Dermagon. The main dwarven force came to a halt a short distance from the city. Narthen went forward towards the eastern gate of Takaran along with Herglon, Remthul, and his bodyguard. He saw the massed group of horses that were the full tri-horde away to his right as he approached the gates, and around the south side of the city came an army of humans largely on foot. Progress is a little slow as the ground outside the city had been torn up by the Union encampment and their subsequent hasty retreat. The defenders of Takaran spilled out from the gate as he approached. The women and men who had stayed behind to help but were not soldiers began collecting supplies, while the soldiers were forming into ranks. Directing all of this was a tall figure in armor the likes of which Narthen had never seen before. Upon his head was a visorless helm crafted to look like the head of some monstrous beast with sapphire eyes. He bore gauntlets and greaves that were the color of burnished bronze but were etched with markings he was not familiar with. He wore a dark blue chest plate that was studded with tiny gems that made it look like a night sky. Upon his back was a cloak of midnight black, and slung over his shoulder was a blade to which the dwarf had never seen the equal of. He was moving back and forth energetically and giving commands, which were being obeyed without question. It was then that Narthen noticed the goblin standing by his side. Could this be Val'inar? Narthen thought to himself. It had only been a few months since he had last seen the elf. He cannot have changed that much, surely. He did not recall the elf radiating such power when they parted company. His thoughts were confirmed when a tall woman wearing the robe of Quar came forth from the gates at the head of a band of Tri and joined the goblin at the figure's side. That is certainly Dessalia, so that must be Val'inar. How changed he is, how powerful and how commanding. It was then that he had moved close enough for the figure to notice him. Narthen, bellowed Val'inar, while Narthen was still some distance from him. My dear dwarf, it has been far too long. By your following, I take it that your mission to the Dresh Mountains was a success. It is good to see you again, Val'inar, beamed Narthen in reply. Forgive me for not greeting you sooner. I hardly recognized you. And my mission to the Minaran dwarves was a resounding success. As I suspected, Premnon Gremnal of the Minaran dwarves was already at war with the Union and was glad to join his cause to ours. This is Remthul, Herglon of the Minaran and General of the army, which was sent to your aid. I am pleased to make your acquaintance, said Val'inar, bowing low. I am honored to have such a mighty force of dwarves fight by our side. I am having a space prepared for us to have a council. It should be ready any moment. I would like the advice of both of you as to our next move. I would recommend that you have your army have a hearty lunch, as there may be such much expected of them in the next few days, and not much time for a good meal. Remthul, a tall and quite heavy-set dwarf of elderly years, possessing a long braided beard of snow white, hanging past his belt, and wearing a single long chainmail hauberk with a symbol of the Minaran dwarves, 2 silver mining picks crossed over a white battle axe on a field of sable. Woven upon it, with a single axe tucked into his belt, stepped forward and returned the elf's bow. Premnon sends his greetings and his army to Val'inar, son of Yanira, last of the fabled Highborn. May your enemies fall before you, your might. May you succeed in all things, and in so doing bring success to us. May the stone smile upon your endeavors. May the stone be pliant to your will. This is the message sent by Premnon. After Val'inar had thanked him for these kind words, the Herglon turned and ordered his bodyguard to return to his soldiers and order that they eat a hearty meal, for they would, in all likelihood, be marching shortly. Both dwarves then followed Val'inar and the other commanders toward a table that was being set up in one of the few spots that was relatively clear of damage, under the shade of a mighty tree, with a number of chairs about it. Val'inar bid them all sit, taking the spot at the head of the table himself. While they were taking their seats, Narthik could not help but notice how tired Val'inar looked without his helm. Introductions were made all around. To Valinar's right sat Urgar, representing the Krelvan goblins, although he was the only one present, and companion in toil and travel to Val'inar. To his right sat Salia, Triquar of the Tri-People, and to her right sat Gilth, the leader of the Tri-Windriders. Narthan sat to Valinar's left. To his left sat Remthil, and to his left sat Prince Damus of the Kingdom of Camarol, and leader of the fabled Shadow Knights. At the other end of the table sat Lady Myra of the Duchy of Romolda. While these introductions were taking place, several men and women brought everyone around the table plates, cups, knives, and forks. They then brought to the table a number of loaves of fine dark bread, several varieties of hard cheese, several trays of salted beef, and some early ripe apples. Numerous jugs of wine were also brought to them. Before beginning, Val'inar bade them eat while they discussed what their next course of action should be. Once everyone had filled their plates and their cups, Val'inar addressed the group. I would like to thank you for all that you have done through at my behest and on behalf of the cause of overcoming the Union. Your sacrifices have made this whole endeavor to end their tyranny and foil the plans of Ushara possible. Before we discuss what is to be done, I would like a full reporting of all the forces that we have at our disposal. Val'inar beckoned to Desalia and Gilth to begin. Gilth swallowed a hunk of cheese he had been chewing on and said, "We have some 25,000 all a horse. Many use bows, few use lances. And we have some 300 corps whose power will be useful to us in battle," interjected Desalia at the end of Gilth's report. Val'inar signaled Lady Myra to proceed next. "We have about 18,000 foot and some 2,000 horse. 3,000 are archers, 1,200 are men-at-arms, and the rest are the halberdiers of the Storm Guard. The cavalry is all heavy." When Prince Damus was called upon to address the group, he continued to peel an apple with his knife without once looking down at his hands. "Uninjured and armed for battle, we have 500 soldiers at this moment in Takaran. Most are men-at-arms, but 20 are knights. However, I have just been informed that the army of Camarol is mobilizing. There will be 2 regiments at Takaran early tomorrow, so we will not need to leave but a token force to defend the city. In addition, the Tri have informed me that 4 regiments of men-at-arms and 2 whole squadrons of the elite Paladin Guard are also on their way, and thanks to the speed of the Tri, if we inform them of our intentions, they should be able to meet up with our army sometime tomorrow evening." Finally, it was Remthil's turn to report to the group. "I have been sent with 4 phalanxes of dwarven pikemen, as many Trelnvar, and nearly all of Tremnon's personal guard, the Brotherhood of the Chasm. 20,000 dwarves all told. We also have several small stone throwers and a small force of shapers." Val'inar mulled this information over for a while he picked almost distractedly at his food. "So, depending upon when we meet the Union army in battle, we may have as little as 65,000 soldiers in the field. We made that army pay dearly for attacking Takaran, but not as dearly as I had hoped for. They still outnumber us and have an advantage in both arms and experience. I am open to suggestions." Lady Myra was the first to speak. "I say that we should wait and gather our forces with the armies of Camarol here and then deal with them." Urgar countered this argument. "But if the Union army returns before our strength is gathered, we will be forced to fight with our backs to the city, or we shall be besieged within a city that cannot support our numbers for long. We would simply be starved out in a matter of weeks." "I agree with the Goblin," nodded Desalia. "We should engage them in the open plain and soon. They are demoralized and have left many of their supplies behind. If we fight them now, we will have an advantage, and in the open plain we can make use of our superiority of cavalry. My Tri-warriors shall run circles around the mighty legions of the Union." There was a silence for a few moments as people took the debate in before Damus quietly admitted, "Urgar and Desalia are correct. It would be better to fight them while they are demoralized and wearied. As much as I hate to acknowledge it, despite the focus we will we still put on training, the army of Kemral is not what it once was. Our armies are large, well equipped, and well trained, but we have not fought a war in 2 generations. Against the legions of the Union, hardened in the fire of their unification wars, I think sadly little of our chances. I would agree with these last few statements, said Remthol, after taking a long drink of wine. Dwarven pikemen are all but unassailable in pitched battle, but we are useless behind stone walls. It seemed to Narthan that Val'inar waited several somber moments before providing his own opinion. I have been thinking along the same lines as many of you. If we do not pursue, they will simply return in a day or two and destroy us. Or they could catch wind from their scouts that we have reinforcements coming from every corner of the Terra, which they do not already control, and will turn to destroy our reinforcements one by one before they can all join up. Staying and waiting gives them every advantage. It will be difficult, but trapping and destroying their army seems the only way forward. Why must we destroy them? Inquired Damus. If we have as many allies as you say, would it not be better to bring them to negotiation? If you were in their position, would you listen to negotiation? Smiled Val'inar. Their army is extremely large and veteran, and is unbeaten in the field. Damus nodded in understanding, but Urgar spoke up next. But if the army is destroyed, will it not inspire the Union to fight back all the harder? Eventually, mused Remthol, stroking his beard, once the news is sunk in, there will be rage, and the Union will raise a new army and fortify their borders. However, if we can deal them a crushing and sudden blow, we might just have a small window in which they will be open to negotiating with us. Is it worth the risk, though? Inquired Myra. If we are forced to meet them in the field before our forces are gathered, it may well be we who are destroyed. That is true, admitted Val'inar, and I certainly have no intention of leading anyone to a certain death, but we have the initiative and many reinforcements on the way. You mentioned trapping, inquired Urgar, who was studying Val'inar intently. Yes, Val'inar nodded. Lady Myra is correct. We do not have the forces to have much chance of winning a pitched battle now, but our enemy is retreating to the west, where we have the graphic dwarves, the Krelven goblins, and the elves of Taranu massing for war. If we shadow the army of the Union, not so close as to risk sudden battle, but close enough to prevent them moving against any of our allies unhindered, we can drive them towards our allies. Won't that mean marching further away from our allies in Kemral? Inquired Myra. Not if we can keep them in the northern plains. The hills and rugged terrain will slow their progress, and it will allow our forces from Kemral to catch us up using the river valleys of central and southern Shaddai, advised Damus. While what I propose is certainly not without risk, but the dangers of doing nothing are greater still, observed Val'inar. I propose that unless there are other suggestions, we conclude our meal and move our army out. All nodded and then turned to look at Lady Myra, who said, I am with you to the end, Val'inar. My proposal was merely what I view as the prudent course of action. Having heard the other arguments in your own words, however, I agree that now is not the time for caution. Val'inar smiled at this. I thank you all for joining me and for agreeing to follow my plan. I know that it is not easy for many of you to trust an outsider and a creature from your own legends, no less, but I hope that I shall live up to the trust you put in me by following my lead. Now finish your lunches. We have a lot of work to do and a long march ahead of us before this day is out. Everyone finished eating quickly and then departed to see to their soldiers. A token force was at Takaran to support those citizens of the city who had stayed and fought in the siege. Although the soldiers had been diligent in gathering supplies while their leaders met, it still took nearly 2 hours to order the army and set off in pursuit of the enemy. Tryout riders went ahead to make sure that the enemy did not wait in ambush and to give updates of their movements. Val'inar ordered that the army make what haste it could. Although the enemy had around 4 hours head start on them, he hoped to make some of that time up. Narthan knew that this was a difficult gamble, however, as marching the soldiers too fast would exhaust them before the coming battle, but marching them too slowly would allow the enemy to reform and hit them head on with their full force, or else escape to cause havoc elsewhere. Narthan figured that their soldiers were likely better rested, as the Union soldiers had exerted themselves a great deal the previous days and had taken severe casualties in the process. Narthan hoped that this, along with having to turn and fly before an inferior force, would be damaging upon their morale, although he was not sure what good it would do. As Narthan marched, he reflected that it was nice to be above ground. This was an unusual feeling for a dwarf, but the previous months had been trying for him. The Union had watched the overland routes between the dwarven clans diligently, no doubt that because they did not wish to see the union of the Graphic and Minaran dwarves. Narthan and a small group of soldiers had therefore taken the Dark Road. Long ago it had been the Vildrench, the Tunnel of Meetings, but it fell more and more into disuse as distance grew in the relationship between the dwarven clans, and had not been used in hundreds of years at least. It was said that there had always been something in the deepest parts of those tunnels, and that once they fell into disuse, none who went into them ever returned. He had always assumed that the Minaran had held them prisoner, but he had learned how wrong he was. Things dwelled in the darkness beneath the mountains. It was, if he was any judge, somewhere beneath the Dragon's Peak that he and his companions had encountered one of them. He did not know what it had been, nor did he wish to know. All he knew was that it had killed all but himself and one of his companions, and that he had felled it in the deep darkness. His arrival from the Dark Road was heralded by the Minaran dwarves as a sign to oppose the Union openly, and after listening to his stories carefully, they had agreed to throw all their support behind Val'inar, although that was not without some easiness. Both he and the other soldier had been well celebrated and questioned about their deeds in the Dark Road. The soldier had been driven half-mad by the experience, and Narthan was not inclined to talk about it. For the moment, he was strangely happy to find himself walking beneath the open sky, which had once been disquieting to him. He vowed to himself that he would one day see to it that the passage was cleared properly and reopened, in honor of all those who had died. Val'inar kept the army marching until about an hour after the fall of night, and Narthan was convinced that the only reason he had stopped even then was that the terrain was getting hillier and it was better to see where they were going. Camp was made hastily, and soldiers were given a filling but simple meal of bread, cheese, and a small draught of beer before being ordered to their rest. Narthan joined the other commanders with Val'inar shortly before he went to rest himself. The Outriders had sent word that they had managed to make up about an hour on the Union army, who had camped shortly before night had fallen. Val'inar seemed pleased by this and said a few words of encouragement and praise for the willingness of the soldiers to undergo such arduous marching before heading to get some rest, which he looked like he sorely needed. The army was roused at dawn in order to form up for march immediately, and as they marched, bread and water were distributed to eat. The pace was nearly the same as the day before, although maintaining such a pace over hills was difficult. As a result, shortly before noon, Val'inar ordered a mild slackening of the pace so as not to overtax his soldiers. There had been some concern that the enemy would have formed up to fight, but the Outriders brought news about an hour after dawn that the Union army was still moving towards the mountains. Their report was also encouraging, as it now appeared that the Union had been forced to leave many of their supplies behind, and as such seemed to have little else but bread and water. Val'inar found himself beside Val'inar during the day's march, and they recounted to each other all that they had experienced since parting company. He was astonished at much of what he heard, most particularly the battle with the last Deep Lord of the Dwarves, and the sacrifice his ancestors had made. Val'inar was surprised at the report of Narthan's deeds, and upon hearing of what he had encountered beneath the Dragon's Peak, he vowed to assist Narthan in clearing the deep places of such creatures, once the present crisis had been dealt with. Narthan was more than grateful for his offer of assistance, since he was still not sure what he had fought or how he had managed to overcome it. Narthan spent much of that day reflecting upon his experience, as he noticed that as the day progressed, they were moving ever closer to the Dragon's Peak. The oldest legends of his people warned against approach to that mountain from above or below. It had been a brave dwarf who built that road directly beneath it. It had lasted for several thousand years, but he supposed that it was inevitable that whatever power existed at the Dragon's Peak would eventually reassert its control. The day continued much the same as the previous day, the slow rolling of the hills and the mountains looming larger and larger in the distance. His spirits were lightened a little towards dusk when the promised force of Kemral arrived. The Paladin Guard in their shining full-plate armor were certainly as impressive a sight as he had heard, although, given the conversation that had taken place the previous day, he wondered if they would live up to their reputation on the battlefield. Of course, he reflected the same could also be said for the famed Brotherhood of the Chasm. Val'inar called the halt at nightfall that day so that the soldiers could get a proper meal and get a proper night's sleep. Val'inar opened up to himself, Myra, and Urgar that evening after the meeting that he had seen a vision that a great battle was looming. When Myra pressed him about specifics, he admitted that he had only seen a couple of brief glimpses of the battle, but could not see its outcome or even when it would be fought. The following morning, Val'inar ordered a proper breakfast to be cooked and served to the soldiers before the march resumed. This proved a wise course of action, as it was just as the camps were being struck and the armies forming for the march that the Outriders brought a report that the Union army had turned and was now arraying themselves for battle. The enemy had deployed in a long line upon a ridge, the west of which was protected by a sharp drop of some 20 feet into the river Dermagon beyond, and around which was a small but thick forest. To the east were a series of jutting rocks that were nearly impassable. To the north was a gradual series of hills rising towards the mountains, but the southern face was about 100 yards of very steep hillside that their army would have to attack. They had massed their archers on either wing and appeared to be keeping their horse in reserve. "How did we not see them repositioning?" demanded Urgar as he entered the planning tent, still finishing putting on his armor. "It was a dark and moonless night," observed Gilt with his usual calm, "and they left watchfires burning where they were, so until dawn we did not realize that they had turned back. Several of my patrols are missing as well, clearly picked off by their mages or archers." "What are they waiting for?" growled Remthal. "They have us at their mercy." "I would guess our elven friend is the reason," mused Prince Damas. "After their experience at Takaran, they are likely concerned for some kind of trap or trick, even with their stealthy countermarch." "They are definitely hoping that we attack them," said Narthan, noting the Union's excellent position. "Can we move away from their army?" inquired Urgar, now somewhat calmer. "Or perhaps we can maneuver around them?" "I wish we could," said Myra. "As I counseled 2 days ago, pursuing this army would be dangerous to pursue, but their position watches every way we could possibly escape. They have done to us what we hope to do to them. If we attempt to do anything but attack, they'll know we don't have any tricks. They'll know we don't have any tricks we are preparing, and will attack our army while it is in disarray." Val'inar had been nodding along with this conversation, deep in thought, and on this he finally spoke up. "I can see the wisdom in what you are saying. I had planned on shadowing the Union army until we could join up with more of our allies, but I fear that our only chance now is to battle. The question remains of how. Is there any possibility we could flank them or get into a better position?" Gilth shook his head. "The rocks around our right flank have no cover on approach, and would easily reposition their army to counter us, and in fact could flank us easily. The forest around the river to our left would make for a great ambush, but my riders report that it is thick enough that it would take the better part of a day to position any soldiers there, which we don't have time for." Val'inar nodded. "Then I see no other option but to strike while we hopefully still have some advantage of morale. Let us prepare for battle." All present nodded grimly and left the tent to give order and prepare. The dwarven pikemen were to anchor the center. The foot soldiers of Kemral, along with the Brotherhood of the Chasm and the Telmaran, would form the left wing, The force from Romalda would form the right wing. The tri-horse archers would harass the enemy, while their lancers would join with the knights of Cameral and Romalda and swing wide to the right around the rocks and see if they could hit them from the rear. Val'inar spoke briefly and eloquently on the necessity of their actions and the glory to be had for winning such a battle, while the soldiers prepared themselves for what promised to be a long day. Then, taking command of the right wing and giving Remfil the center and Myra the right, the army advanced. Remfil gave Narthen command of the Trelnvar and the Brotherhood on the left wing as he found himself once more beside Val'inar. The archers moved forward ahead of the main force and began to unload volleys upon the enemy once they were in range. This had little effect on the Union soldiers with their large shields. The Union archers had no response to this. They were being smart, Narthen realized. They did not wish to waste arrows until the battle was fully joined. More concerning, however, was the fact that even when their soldiers got within range, only a few small volleys were fired. The Union had something planned for them. There was little time to wonder once battle was joined. The discipline of the Union legions was truly impressive. They kept their formation even under the onslaught of the dormant Trelnvar, whose preferred method of combat was both wild and destructive. The first soldier he found himself facing clearly had never found himself in combat with a dwarf before. The young man held his shield as one would against another human, and while his shield was large, it was not nearly long enough. It took but one swing below the shield to bring the man to the ground, and a swift stroke to finish the job. The next two soldiers Narthen faced met similar fate, but the next one had clearly learned the lesson. She lowered the shield properly and expertly blocked several of his axe blows, although the wooden shield was not undamaged. It was after the third such blow that the soldier's sword sliced through the air at him quicker than he had been expecting, which he only just managed to avoid. Downstroke, jab came her follow-up attacks, which soon had Narthen backing away. Narthen deflected to his left another strong downstroke, which sent the soldier slightly off balance. Narthen took advantage of this by throwing his right shoulder as hard as he could into her shield. Narthen grunted in pain as the force jammed his shoulder. The impact, however, was accompanied by a satisfying crack as the shield burst into pieces, and the soldier was thrown onto her back. Narthen had just enough time to sidestep and pivot a wild charge by another soldier. The man staggered forward, gasped his surprise at his opponent's agility, and then all he could do was gurgle out the last seconds of his life with Narthen's axe at his back. The other soldier was on her feet by this point and raised her sword to defend herself as Narthen wrenched his axe free. The soldier parried his attack with consummate skill, but it looked as though her arm had been broken along with the shield. It was not until his seventh blow that he was able to take advantage of this, bringing his axe handle hand around and cracking her on the arm. She gasped in pain, and her next block was just a little too late at the cost of her life. For the moment, Narthen found himself among dwarves, and as such he took the respite to survey the battle. It appeared as though his soldiers were driving the enemy backward, although he gave orders to regroup when he noticed how scattered his soldiers were. Val'inar was to Narthen's left and was the center of a cluster of enemy soldiers. He was a little way in front of the Cameral men-at-arms and seemed to always be fighting several at once. Now grouped a little better, Narthen ordered a continuation of the advance and took a small force of the Brotherhood of the Chasm and led them in the direction of Val'inar. By the time they had reached him, Val'inar was taking advantage of the enemy's pullback to survey how things stood. Being pleased with the progress of the left wing, Val'inar strode back into the fray with Narthen at his side. To Narthen, Val'inar seemed a whirlwind of power, felling more enemies with his magecraft than with any of the strokes of his blade. The only indication that what he was doing took effort was so easily did Val'inar move through the battlefield was the look of intense concentration upon his face. This went on for a little while until Narthen noticed that no longer was the enemy falling back before him. It was true that few dared approach Val'inar, but the enemy was now pushing back. The enemy front line appeared to be reinforced now by their seconds, and within a space of moments this reinforcement of soldiers had brought their advance to the halt. It was at their front ranks were just starting to be forced back that Val'inar suddenly cried for the soldiers to take cover as a volley of arrows began to land thickly amongst their forces. Val'inar was able to destroy some, but he too had been caught almost without warning and did not have enough time to deflect them all. The battle continued in this ever-bloody stalemate for but a brief time when the first messenger arrived from the other wing, where the same was being met. Val'inar ordered that all soldiers reform ranks as much as possible and resume the press. He also ordered that the cavalry should go to work upon their now hopefully well-distracted opponent. Narthan, at the head of the Brotherhood, threw himself into the enemy ranks. They made some little headway, but it seemed the enemy had already put their third line in, and so their renewed charge was halted almost immediately. Narthan could do little but credit the skill with which the Union's general was conducting the battle. Even with Val'inar at their head, the left wing was beginning to be pushed backward once more, as news came from the rest of the battlefield. The Triad met with heavy casualties as the ridge gave the Union archers a slight advantage in range, and with such a great mass of horses, even spread out, their volleys were effective. The heavy cavalry was faring little better in their attempted flanking maneuver to the right, harassed by enemy archers and forced back in a clash with the Union's own cavalry. The left and right wings were now definitively being forced backward, even though the Union had not yet committed their full force. Only the Dwarven phalanxes were able to hold their ground, but even they were forced to pull back so as not to find themselves surrounded. Try as he might, even Val'inar was not able to turn the tide on the left. Word soon came that the right wing was being strongly pushed back. They were maintaining good orders, and the casualties were not yet as severe, but if things did not change, there would be only a matter of time before they routed. Narthan rushed forward with some of the Brotherhood in his own attempt to force the Union to fall back once more, but he soon found himself surrounded by 3 of their soldiers. He let his instincts take over, and his axe was soon a blur of blocks and parries. His very body became a weapon as he fought to keep them off of him. One was not well skilled and fell quickly, the other 2 proved more challenging. As he finally landed the killing stroke on the last of them, he was too slow in turning around. A spear tore through his chainmail, bursting several links and driving into his left shoulder. The white-hot pain shot through Narthan's shoulder and arm, and he grunted as the man pulled his weapon free to land the killing blow. Narthan had enough presence of mind to turn, thanking the rock that he was still on his feet as he did so, and strike out with what power he possessed. The man did not get his killing blow, but the effort and the pain brought Narthan to his knees. Another 2 soldiers moved towards him, but were cut off by Val'inar. Shrugging off what anyone else would have been a debilitating blow, the elf cut down Narthan's assailants, and several others moved in his direction, moved away to find easier opponents. Val'inar then snapped an order, and 2 members of the Brotherhood dashed forward and half helped and half carried Narthan free of the front lines as he turned to lend his aid elsewhere. It was a few moments later, when Narthan was having one of his healers tend to his shoulder, that he first heard it, horns in the distance, some strange and some strangely familiar. He chuckled to himself. I must have lost a lot of blood already. I am hearing things. But then, to his surprise, a volley of arrows arced over his head towards the enemy. The arrows were of a fletching which Narthan had never seen before. To add to his confusion, the air was soon filled with bellows of strange beasts, and what looked like a shower of stars which almost instantly wreaked havoc in the Union lines. Narthan dashed off to find Val'inar over the objections of the heroes. "What is going on here, my friend?" inquired Narthan, his breath coming in painfully from his only partially treated wound. "It seems the reinforcements which I had hoped to meet up with have arrived ahead of schedule," smiled Val'inar. "But the first of those calls I heard was the typical horn call of the graphic dwarves," said Narthan, still puzzled. "But surely that isn't possible that they would be so far east on the plain." He had barely finished saying this when, after a final volley of arrows, a large crowd of forest elves came charging through their ranks, led by elven magi mounted upon Filtar beasts, and threw themselves into the Union soldiers who fell back before them. While Narthan tried to comprehend what was going on, Val'inar began barking orders to those around him to support the elves in their assault. One of the elven magi, whose deep green robes seemed to have been carefully embroidered with golden vines, and wearing a flower coronet upon his head and a long wooden staff covered with ruins, rode up to you. "Greetings to you, my brother," beamed the elf. "I would imagine that you have not expected us to arrive so soon." "Indeed I did not, my brother, but you are most welcome," replied Val'inar with a relieved smile. "How were you able to bring your forces here so quickly?" "It seems our star-eyed brethren have a good eye on the goings-on of Sirana. They figured that you would need help sooner than even you had anticipated when you set them to their task, and so encouraged us not to wait for you, but to begin the march as soon as we were able." "How many were you able to muster?" "We have some 3,000 elves from the various tribes of Taranu, 4 legions of Graphic dwarves, and a like number of goblins," replied the mounted elf. Narthan smiled. "I thought I heard the war horns of my people. I thought I had been dreaming." Targotha opened his mouth to respond when another message came to inform them that the right wing had been reinforced by 2 regiments of Cameralian men-at-arms, with four more expected on the field within the hour, and the bulk of the Paladin Guard was now driving the enemy cavalry back. After Val'inar had ordered the messenger to tell all positions to press the attack, with all earnestness he turned once more to his brother for answers. "Well," he began, "on your advice we began massing our forces when you left. We had just about decided to send scouting parties out to determine what was going on, when the Inera Elfin made themselves known to us and began to guide us and put us in contact with Slowbrag Brawl and Lord Irtla and encourage us to make haste." Val'inar, who had been nodding along with his brother's story, cut in. "I am glad that you were able to carry out my plan so well, although I still do not understand how they were able to communicate with you so effectively." "You can ask them yourself after the day is won," replied Targotha with a grin. "You mean they are here?" "Of course," nodded the green-clad elf, indicating the twinkles of light falling and exploding in bright flashes among the Union soldiers. "What did you think was the origin of such magecraft as that?" "Did you have any trouble bringing your forces here? Did the Union make note of your movements and try to stop you?" "Yes, brother," replied Targotha simply, "but that is a tale which can wait. Enough talking, we still have a battle to win. The enemy has gotten over the shock of our coming, and it looks like we are once more meeting stiff resistance. Come, brother, we have much of this awful business still before this day is done, and I would imagine we'll need that sword arm and famous skill of yours." And with that, the 2 brothers rejoined the fray as the battle, now shifting in their favor, raged around them. That is the conclusion of Chapter 22. I really hope you enjoyed it. I would love to hear your thoughts, comments, feedback on anything about the chapter, voices, whatever, down below. Also be fantastic if you would help me and my channel out by liking, sharing, and subscribing, all down below, as well as checking out my website, checking out my books, socials, all that good stuff. All of that's posted down below. In the meantime, I do hope you all have a wonderful day, get a chance to do or experience something creative, and I'll catch you on the next one.